Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome to the chairmanship. Look forward to working with you. And Dr. Elmendorf, I just want to thank you for your extraordinary service. Served on this committee now for going on 3 years, and you have done such a great job of giving us unbiased and very thoughtful and thorough advice. I want to thank you for that. I think we've got universal agreement around this table on one thing, and that is debt. The debt is a problem, and the interest rate is a looming serious problem. We've all made statements about how interest rates, if it goes up 1% increase in interest rates, costs $180 billion a year. And that is going to sink us. And it's money that goes for nothing. It doesn't buy anything. In fact, what it does is buy airports in China, because that's where the interest, a significant amount of the interest is going. So the question is, not is debt and deficit a problem, the question is, how do we deal with it? And there's several ways. One is the Budget Control Act and the sequester. My problem with that, and I think one of the most important charts in your material is on page 62 that shows the outlays by types of expenditures over history. And what that shows is that discretionary spending, including defense and non-defense, is at virtually an all-time low and headed for certainly an all-time low as a percentage of the economy. And yet, most of our budget cutting effort around here seems to focus on that relatively small target. And the real increases, on page 17 you have a chart of what's driving the increases. The real increases are in health care and in other mandatory programs. When we are cutting Head Start or the defense budget in order to try to solve this debt and deficit problem, it's like attacking Brazil after Pearl Harbor. It's a vigorous reaction, but it's the wrong target. The real growth, if you look at your chart, is in mandatory spending, and then there's a fundamental question about revenues. You mentioned that the historic level is 17.5%. We're now at about 18.5%. The question that we have to grapple with as public officials here is 18.5% or 18% or 19%. What's the right number given the demographics of America in 2015 through 2030? We cannot keep the commitments we've made to people who are retiring and maintain any level of discretionary spending without some additional revenues. The arithmetic simply doesn't work. And I think an interesting debate here would be, what's the right level? Is it 20% of GDP? If you add the numbers together on your projections, it's 22.3%. That's 14.2 for mandatory, 5.1 for discretionary, and 3.0 for interest. So anything short of 22.3% equals a deficit, and the problem continues to get worse. So it seems to me we've really got to look at and be realistic about what's happening, because if we don't deal with both the growth of mandatory spending, which is mostly in health care, and look at the revenue side, we're on a path that there's really no way out, because unless the American people want us to drive discretionary spending, including national security, to zero, that's the direction that we're headed. So I would go back to when President Reagan was president. 10% of GDP was discretionary spending. We're headed for 5.1, in half of what it was when Reagan was president. The difference, interestingly, in 1990 between discretionary and mandatory was 1%. 9% was discretionary, 10% was mandatory. Those two lines are separating dramatically, and that's the problem. But to think that we can solve it entirely by revenues, I think, is unrealistic. To think that we can solve it entirely by cutting programs that are benefiting people who we made commitments to is unrealistic. There's got to be somebody around here has got to be saying, here's the arithmetic, and here's how we have to solve this problem. If you can find a question in there, Dr. Elmendorf, you're better than I. But would you agree that the overall analysis is that we've got to look at you know, Willie Sutton, you got to go where the money is, and the money is in mandatory spending and in revenues based upon the change of demographics?
Yes, Senator, we agree with that given how low discretionary spending is already on track to be relative to our historical experience, there seems no way around the country agreeing to either cut some of the large benefit programs relative to the benefits promised under current law, or to increase tax revenues well above the historical share of GDP, or to do some combination of those changes.
But on the cutting side, I want to emphasize, we don't have to necessarily cut. We have to get control of healthcare costs, which we spend twice as much per capita than anybody else in the world. And if we could just control that, it would solve a great deal of this problem. It's not necessarily cutting fees to doctors or cutting, saying we're just not going to pay as much. We've got to get at the underlying structural costs that are driving these extraordinarily high healthcare costs.
So yes, Senator, if there were ways to, when I refer to cutting benefits in the programs, I mean cutting the spending for those benefits, if there are ways to provide comparable benefit as viewed by a beneficiary at lower cost, then that would help. I think there is widespread agreement among analysts that our healthcare system should move in the direction of paying for care not per unit in a way that encourages volume, but by paying for keeping people healthy at the lowest possible cost. But once you get beyond that general principle, exactly what changes in federal laws or federal policies could achieve those goals is very unclear. And part of what was put in place in the Affordable Care Act is a collection of specific changes and also some mechanisms to experiment with other changes, and those experiments are underway. But just which ones will pan out and how well is very hard to know at this point.
Thank you, Dr. Elmendorf. I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.